just to say thanks very much to both our speakers. They've given us a huge amount of food for thought. If you still have any questions you would like to ask, please put them in the chat box now. But we have some questions in, and maybe I'll begin with one for Salome. How is climate change affecting the lives of young people and families in Malawi?
Thank you. It's a difficult but easy question in a way to respond. But I can say the young people in Malawi are the most affected because our population is mostly the youth. When there is flooding, it means there are no schools. When the temperatures are high, like 48 degrees, nobody's going to school. The schools are closed. It means they're not learning. Their learning is affected. And again, during flooding, in all the areas that are affected by floods, there is no school. That will be like 2-3 months within the learning season. They are not going to school. And when the families have no food, it means they are not going to school. When they're not going to school, they get married. They're just idle in the home. It's just a wave of all the issues, emotional issues. Some have lost their parents because of flooding. So they are all affected in so many ways, in an unimaginable way, if I may call it. I don't know if I've tried to respond to the question. Thank you.
Actually, you reminded me of something. You actually said people get married. We've done a series of podcasts and in 5 different countries in different parts of Africa last year. And in one place, one of the people said, because of climate change and because of the poverty it's bringing, it's forcing girls to be married younger. So there's an impact that lots of people wouldn't sort of realize is a reality in Africa today because of climate change. And maybe if we move on now to a question for John. Would it be better for us to spend our time advocating directly to politicians or building community action for policy change?
Well, I'll give it politicians' answer. Of course, it's both. We need to both use the existing political system, the state, and its enormous resources. Isn't it amazing how we can send millions to Netanyahu to bomb people in Palestine, or to Vladimir Zelensky in his battle against Russia, but suddenly we've no money for our health system or housing. So my message to you today, do not believe politicians when they say there is no money. There's always money for war. So why can't we use the money that we're spending on war in terms of helping our brothers and sisters in the global south, or indeed in engaging in climate adaptation? We're going to have to inevitably adapt our societies because there's too much climate change already baked in, as they say. So it seems to me that we need to do both. For me, I'm a great believer in we need to have local wins. I think we need to recreate, or not recreate, but create community at the local level and begin to experiment in new ways of living, because we can't depend upon the state, even though the state has a responsibility, don't get me wrong. I often think that we are the people we've been waiting for. You know, I'm a great believer in let's not ask for permission, maybe forgiveness if the thing we did was the wrong thing, but we shouldn't wait around for government. We should definitely hold government to do everything it can, and it has enormous resources. And again, I look at what we did during the pandemic. Now, don't get me wrong, many governments made many mistakes. I think a lot of older people in our communities died unnecessarily because so much attention was being put on frontline hospital services. But by and large, that to me is the kind of model. That was a public health emergency, and our lives changed quite radically as a result of that. And here's the thing, how many of you on this call, particularly those listening in Ireland, did you know that the Dáil in 2019 declared a climate and ecological emergency? And the Northern Ireland Assembly in 2021. So both parts of the island, the main government bodies have declared a climate and ecological emergency. But forgive my French, WTF? What does that mean? You know, where do we see the same action that governments took in that public health emergency of a science-led response, where we had the Taoiseach and the Prime Minister, when they were given daily briefings, they had the epidemiologists, the medical experts there. Where's the same when it comes to the climate and ecological crisis? You know, why aren't we getting briefings of the impacts of the climate on Ireland? Again, another thing many of you probably don't know, your chips are going to be much more expensive this year. And the reason is that we lost about 20% of the Irish potato crop because of flooding, where farmers simply couldn't get into the field. So in other words, we must also connect, as I think Salome was pointing out, there's a food insecurity dimension to the climate and ecological crisis. So again, it's both. We need to have local action, and I do think we need much more, up to the point I would even say rebellious or revolutionary action, particularly by our young people, in terms of not waiting around for politicians, but doing it themselves. And I would include asking ourselves these questions. Why should democracy end at the classroom door? Why should democracy end at the factory door or the office door? I think the solutions are often in these places where we come together in school, in work, or our communities to share our views. And I'm not saying anybody's going to accept what I've said here, but it is about my honest kind of offering as a public servant. And I think academia or the academy, we should see ourselves as part of the public sector. And our job is to help our communities to figure these things out. But I don't think there's going to be one size fits all. We need that local innovation. We need to try out new ways of helping each other at local level. But we do need the state. And I am bitterly disappointed at the lack of action, the lack of even basic understanding of the climate and ecological crisis by our politicians. But they often react to what people want. And a last word, of course, and that's particularly for the island of Ireland, I am really, really worried at the way in which special interests in the farming community have riled up our farming and rural communities against climate action. We have this very unhealthy kind of separation now between farmers versus environmentalists and climate activists. Farmers are part of the solution. They are stewards of the land. And I think we need to really start calling out, in my view, the disgraceful lack of leadership by the Irish Farmers Association and the Ulster Farmers Union here in the north. We need to be all coming together to reassure farmers that they are not the cause of the problem. But a bit like I said about capitalism and about carbon energy, we need to thank our farmers for their service, but we cannot continue with a grass-fed beef and dairy agricultural system. And I say that not because I'm somehow, full disclosure, I am a vegan, but that's not the reason why I'm saying it. The science is really clear. So I think we need to be grateful to capitalism, grateful to carbon energy, and grateful to industrial agriculture for all its produce, but we cannot continue.
Okay, thanks for that, John. Just for balance, we go back to Salome again. Have communities and people being able to rebuild their local infrastructures and their homes after the cyclone? And if so, do they get support from other people, say like governments or agencies, to do that?
Yes, the communities that were affected by Cyclone Freddy are rebuilding, but at a very slow pace. Like now, the impacts are still there. Usually, they would build like temporary structures and wait until they have stable income. They find ways of getting income, and then they build a bigger house. But the impacts on infrastructure, on food, there is support from government and even donor agencies are there. But there's some impacts where you have mental health, which is really hard, and we see very little progress. In these areas you go, you see so many people who are mentally ill in areas that were affected by Cyclone Freddy. And the other question was on, sorry, the other part of the question.
It was like, well, first, have they been able to rebuild, and did they get help?
Oh, yeah. So the help is there, but we can't say it's adequate. Like we're saying, people who are affected by Cyclone Freddy, the number is so huge. So it's rebuilding slowly. They're being affected, they are being supported, but it's very slow progress. And just to echo what John said, like we have issues on climate, governance issues, how we're using our taxes, political issues, all these are there, but they get worse when the impacts are coming from climate. At least if people can grow their own food, then we have moved one step. But now it's not like that. Yeah, so the progress is there, but very slow, if
Okay.
I'm to say so. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. There's lots of other questions come in now, and some of them are overlapping as well. There's one there saying for John, what first step in holding our government to account would you recommend? And then there is another one, John, where do we start? How do we begin to dismantle capitalism? How can we establish an alternative in time?
In 1 minute, I'll give you the cookbook for the revolution. I don't think there is any one size fits all, but as I put in the chat there, I think what we're doing this morning and the work I do in the university and in public meetings, let's educate ourselves initially about this. And none of you should accept anything I've said this morning. You should always be skeptical and, make sure that you're on board with this because, a lot of the problems we have are about very, very persuasive people peddling lies. I mean, look at this post-truth world we now live in online, and so it's really, really frightening where people don't really care about the truth and empirical reality, and so on. So we're having this conversation against this global ecological and climate crisis in a really bad state in terms of the way the world is, in terms of our communication methods. And that's why I think more of these honest conversations are needed. So I think educate, agitate, organize is my kind of go-to 3-part way of beginning this. And to accept, well, what's our shared vision? I mean, again, you've heard me say before, Jared, at these meetings, I was raised a Catholic, but I'm a kind of not even a lapsed Catholic now, I'm a kind of a collapsed Catholic, but I'm a very ethical humanist. And I do think the good book has a lot of good perspectives. And one of them is, without vision, there the people perish. I think part of our problem is that we don't have a vision of what a future society that we want to create is going to be like. And I think in the context of Ireland, the challenges we face in the 21st or the 20th century was decolonization and establishing ourselves as an independent nation after colonization. And we rose to that. We have questions about, we still have partition and, the dominance of our society by interest like the Catholic Church and so on. But it seems to me that we're faced with a similar challenge and opportunity in the 21st century. How do we begin to rethink what Ireland is going to be like in 2100, 2070? And I think that some of the suggestions I was making, more critical about capitalism and carbon and consumerism, but they should all be thrown into the mix in terms of what it is that we're trying to pass on to the next generation. But I'm absolutely convinced, both for ethical reasons, political reasons, but more so for science reasons, we cannot have a green version of what we're currently living in. There's simply no biophysical way we have this green version of our current societies, that we can decarbonize our current economic political system, which is why I've said there is no capitalist solution. What we do about that then, you can join a political party and try and influence it. You can engage in strike action. And I do think, and I speak as a strong unionist, trade unionist, that is, that the unions have a particular role to play. I think faith communities have an enormous role to play, asking ourselves, what would Jesus eat? What would Jesus drive at this time? Where's the GAA? Or here in the north, where's the Orange Order? I mean, we have a lot of big organizations in culture and faith and education, and particularly in the sector I'm in. I think we in the university should hang our heads in shame. We're enormously well-resourced institutions, and yet we are still behaving in a business as usual manner. The world is on fire. The world is collapsing. The life-supporting systems of the planet are collapsing, and we in the academy, supposedly the smart ones, we're still continuing in a business as usual manner. So we have to have all of those recognitions that the way of life and our expectations of the future that we may have in our minds, we have to let go of them. We cannot continue with the mindsets in the way in which we perhaps had in the 20th century. So this is what's known in, education circles and the academy as a paradigm shift. In the same way we move from feudalism to capitalism, we are now looking from capitalism to something else. My only concern is that we will make that transition. We'll have to. My real concern is at what cost? Will it be just? Because here's the thing, just to finish with a rather provocative thought, but it's worth reminding ourselves, if things get really, really bad and we don't attend to the climate and ecological crisis, and for those of us in Ireland, if the AMOC, I don't know if you've heard of this, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, it's basically what we call the Gulf Stream that brings up warm water from the Gulf of Mexico. That's showing signs of cutting off. It's what keeps Ireland temperate. Many of us are living in latitudes that in Canada go below 20 degrees in winter. We don't get those severe winters. But that's showing signs of weakening. And that could be really bad for Ireland and Britain and Western Europe. If it gets that bad, and then it becomes an issue of survival. Here's the thing, folks. You do not need democracy to survive. You don't need human rights to survive. You don't need gender equality, trans equality to survive. All those things we've hard fought for in many countries to make our societies more equal, more gender inclusive, and so on. All of those things go out the window when the issue becomes a matter of brute survival. That's my biggest fear. It's not that humanity won't make it. We're a pretty resilient species. We're like cockroaches. We've been through difficult times in an evolutionary sense in the past. I think humanity will, whatever happens, even a thermonuclear war, humanity, I think, will survive and nature will survive. But it's at what cost? That's what we're in the game for. The planet is not in danger. It really does sometimes annoy me, but more times I have a smile when I see the slogans, oh, save the planet. The planet has seen 5 other mass extinctions. The planet is pretty tough. What we're in the game here is a habitable world for our kids and grandkids, and keeping democracy, equality, human rights, and so on. That's the issue that's at risk. The more we delay, the more our governments don't take action, and the more we as a people don't rise up. It is perfectly legitimate for a people to rise up in rebellion when the government has broken a social contract. And I would say that's the position we're in now. Our government has broken the social contract. They are not protecting us. So what are you going to do? Join me in the revolution, or sit back and watch Netflix and chill?
Yeah, thanks, John. And I'll be back to you with one more question probably before we finish. But for Salome, another question that's come in is, are there any collective moves by Eastern African countries to deal with climate change?
Yes, there are actions within Africa, within the country, and in East Africa. And one key thing at government level is to agree on how this climate is impacting Malawi. And this message is being sent as one voice at COP. And even issues like acknowledging loss and damage, like some people just don't believe that things have changed, like there's climate change. Trying to put in that message, it's one important thing that's happening. So there is collective voice that is being presented at COP, and that's what will help the countries in terms of moving and even financing the impacts that come with climate change. The other interventions are like livelihood issues, livelihood-based issues. We're just talking food, health, water. So those things are at country level. So while we can agree Eastern African, what are the technologies that can help people to live a better life? So those are at country, individual country level. But the voice on what climate is doing to the people is collective at Eastern SADC and Eastern African countries. Thank you.
Okay. John, we have another question here from John McGeady, and he says, if I can play devil's advocate for a moment, because I'd like to hear your response to this concern. He said, we have a housing crisis in Ireland, and we need to build more homes, but it requires money to build houses, to pay builders, and pay for materials. And at present, we do this by getting mortgages that must be paid back with interest. To meet the interest repayments, we need economic growth. So what's your response to this?
Well, actually, Jury in the chat has provided it. We have empty homes across this island. We don't need to build new homes. What we need to do is repurpose the ones that are already there So there's a non-technical, there's a revolutionary, radical solution, don't get me wrong. But I think that's the type of thinking we need. I mean, for me, if I haven't been provocative enough already, what we're facing is the equivalent, maybe even not of the pandemic that I've already referenced. This is wartime mobilization, folks. And how do you react in a war? I mean, that may be an inelegant and rather, not particularly good way of describing it, but I'm just going to use it now as a placeholder to describe the challenge and the crisis that we're facing. We shouldn't get too bogged down with the money issue. As I mentioned earlier, there's plenty of money where we want to, spend on war and so on. But also what we need to start doing is returning to assets. What are the actual assets of our society? Do we have enough land, people, trained people, capital, and so on for the things that we need? And on the issue of the mortgages, you're quite right. Who asked that question? We have a debt-based money system. So when you borrow money, you don't pay back the principal. So you borrow 100 quid, you don't pay back 100 quid. You got to pay back 110 quid. Well, that can be changed. I mean, there are examples in Islam, for example, of non-interest, and let's remember, folks, that historically in European and Christian societies, paying interest was called usury and it was a sin. So it wasn't that long ago that this kind of, economic monetary system we have was unconscionable. It was impossible to think. So I think it's not beyond the wit of human beings to design a monetary system that enables people to, because we do need money in, a modern economy. But it does annoy me, frankly, that we get bogged down. Oh, there's not enough money. The issue is not the money, folks. It's the actual assets of our society that we need to start focusing on. Money is only there to mobilize those assets. Now, again, this will need a whole session in and of itself. But I'm absolutely convinced, in the words of, it was a Gandhi who said, there's enough for everybody in the world for their needs, but not enough for everybody's greed. We need to start looking at that idea of sufficiency, challenging this kind of growth model of accumulation and possessiveness. What sometimes I would describe, because I'm a great fan of popular movies, as you see in my presentation, that character in The Lord of the Rings, Gollum, my precious, that kind of selfishness that's happened in our culture over in the last couple of decades. We haven't always lived in possessive, high consumption, high carbon societies. And I'm not making an argument of going back to the past. There was many bad things about the past. This is about trying to bounce forward to a different way of living. And I think it's possible to do that, but we do have to challenge capitalism. We do have to challenge consumerism. We do have to challenge also carbon. And if that isn't enough C's, we've also got to deal with the legacies of colonialism, because that to me is something that is absolutely central, big on a global scale. That global justice is reparations for the colonization and imperialism and exploitation of other people in other parts of the world. And I think Ireland is uniquely placed as a country that experienced colonization. We should be leading the charge for climate reparations on this issue. And we're not. That's a fault of our governments. And that's where we come in as citizens to demand that they do.
Thanks very much, John. I think that's probably one of the most vibrant and lively Q&As I've ever been on in any event. Thanks to Salome and to John for your responses to the questions.